You were standing inside a machine room in Moscow, sometime in the early 1980s. The Orbitel sits before you, a massive computational engine with integrated circuits arranged in concentric rings, cooling systems that hum with a kind of mechanical insistence, and you are one of perhaps 100 people in the entire world who know it exists. I'm Jacob, and what you're about to learn is that the Soviet Union was building computers so advanced that Western intelligence agencies simply refused to believe the evidence when it finally surfaced. For decades, the narrative about Soviet technology was remarkably consistent. The Soviet Union was technologically backward. They could launch rockets, yes, and they had nuclear weapons, but computers, electronics? The Soviets were believed to be at least 5 to 10 years behind the West, scavenging technology where they could, copying designs when possible, fundamentally limited by a centrally planned economy that couldn't match American innovation. This was not entirely propaganda, though it was partly that. The Soviet consumer electronics market was genuinely underdeveloped. You could not buy a Soviet personal computer. Soviet televisions were crude by Western standards. But this visibility created a profound blind spot. What you see is what you believe you understand. And if you do not see something, you assume it does not exist. In 1979, a team of Soviet scientists and engineers working under the direction of academician Boris Babayan began developing the Orbitel. The name itself is telling. Orbita means orbit in Russian. An Orbitel was intended to be a computer system capable of processing information at scales and speeds that matched American supercomputers of the same period. Not behind them, matching them. The project was funded through the Academy of Sciences in the Soviet military establishment. It operated with a kind of institutional secrecy that made sense in the context of the Cold War. This was not a computer meant for export. This was not a computer meant for the consumer market. This was a machine built to serve the computational needs of the Soviet state itself. The first prototype was completed in 1981. It was built at the Institute for Problems of Information Transfer in Moscow. The design philosophy reflected decades of Soviet research in computing theory, going back to the work of mathematicians like Alexei Lyapunov in the 1950s. Soviet computer science had developed along a different intellectual path than American computer science. Where American companies like IBM were focused on compatibility and market dominance, Soviet researchers were exploring alternative architectures, different approaches to parallelization, and novel solutions to the problem of processing massive datasets in real time. The Orbitel was the culmination of that parallel development. To understand what the Orbitel actually was, you need to understand what Soviet engineers were trying to solve. The Soviet Union needed to process enormous volumes of information. Military targeting systems required real-time analysis of satellite imagery and radar data. Nuclear command and control systems needed fault-tolerant architectures that could survive partial system failure. Scientific research in physics and mathematics generated data sets that required computational horsepower far beyond what smaller machines could deliver. The Orbitel was designed as a modular, massively parallel system. Unlike Western supercomputers of the era, which typically used a smaller number of very fast processors, the Orbitel employed a larger number of more modestly clocked processors working in parallel. This design philosophy had advantages. It distributed heat more evenly across the system. It meant that if one processor failed, the entire machine did not fail. It allowed for flexible configuration depending on the task at hand. The machine could be scaled. More processors could be added. The operating system, which Soviet engineers called the operating environment, was built from the ground up to manage this kind of distributed parallelism. Contemporary Western supercomputers like the Cray-1, which was in operation during the same period, achieved their speed through vector processing and specialized arithmetic units. The Orbitel took a fundamentally different approach. It was, in a real sense, more modern. It anticipated the direction that supercomputer design would move in the 1990s and 2000s. The first Orbitel systems were delivered to Soviet research institutions and military establishments in the early 1980s. By 1985, there were at least 3 operational systems. The Soviet Union kept this secret with almost complete success. American intelligence agencies had heard rumors. They had picked up fragments of information from signals, intelligence, and human intelligence sources. But the rumors seemed implausible. The consensus among American computer scientists and defense analysts was that this was not possible. A supercomputer of this capability required a level of industrial sophistication and scientific coordination that the Soviet system simply could not achieve. The Orbitel became a ghost story in American intelligence files, something that was probably not real, probably a mistake in the information, probably exaggerated. The problem was that the Orbitel was real, and it was not exaggerated. By the mid-1980s, there were 5 operational systems. By 1990, there were more than a dozen, distributed across Soviet research facilities, weapons laboratories, and strategic command centers. Almost no one outside the Soviet system knew about them. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. The Soviet Union did not formally dissolve until December 1991. But the period between these two moments was characterized by a kind of institutional collapse and information flooding that was unprecedented in the Cold War era. Intelligence barriers that had been carefully maintained for decades suddenly became permeable. People who had been bound by secrecy oaths began talking to Western intelligence agencies. Documents that had been locked in archives became accessible. Facilities that had been closed to outsiders were suddenly opened for inspection. In early 1992, a team of American computer scientists and defense analysts visited the Institute for Problems of Information Transfer in Moscow. They were there to assess the state of Soviet computing technology. It was a shock. In the building, they encountered the Orbitel, not a prototype, an operational system. Subsequent visits, more detailed technical discussions, and access to documentation and design specifications revealed the full scope of what had been built. The Orbitel systems that had been developed over the previous decade represented a level of achievement in supercomputing that was genuinely comparable to the most advanced American systems of the same period. In some respects, the Orbitel architecture was more elegant. It was more scalable. It handled certain types of problems more efficiently. The Western computer science community had to recalibrate its understanding of Soviet technological capability. Papers began appearing in technical journals. Researchers who had dismissed Soviet computing as fundamentally backward had to acknowledge that what they had dismissed was instead invisible. The Soviet system had achieved something remarkable. They had built a world-class supercomputer through a process of careful research, iterative development, and institutional commitment. They had done it in secret, and by the time anyone found out, the Soviet Union was already dissolving. The Orbitel program continued in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, but under radically different circumstances. The funding suddenly became precarious. The rationale for a Soviet supercomputer program evaporated almost overnight. In the mid-1990s, as Western companies began donating older computers to Russian research institutions, and as American software companies began establishing operations in Moscow, the Orbitel project gradually faded. It was not immediately abandoned. There was too much institutional investment, too much technical expertise, too much intellectual property. But the trajectory was clear. By 2000, the Orbitel program had effectively ended. Some of the architecture and design principles from the Orbitel were carried forward into subsequent Russian computing projects. Some of the engineers who had worked on the project emigrated to the West, bringing their knowledge and experience with them. But the Orbitel itself, as an active program, as a working supercomputer project, with new systems being built and deployed, ceased to exist. What remained was a historical record. A moment in Cold War history when the technologies we thought we understood turned out to be vastly more complex and capable than anyone had realized. A reminder that secrecy, institutional commitment, and intellectual brilliance could produce remarkable results, even within the constraints of an authoritarian system. The Orbitel was not the only Soviet computing achievement that the West had missed or misunderstood. There were others, and that is where this story leads next. The story of the Orbitel is ultimately a story about invisibility and assumption. We assume that what we can see is what exists. We assume that what we cannot see does not exist. But the cold reality of the Cold War was that entire technological ecosystems developed in a parallel, in secret, unknown to the world. And when those systems finally became visible, when the walls came down and the archives opened, we discovered that our understanding of history had been fundamentally incomplete. The Orbitel was a late-stage expression of a Soviet computing tradition that stretched back decades to the very beginning of the computer age itself. And that beginning, that moment, when the Soviet Union first entered the computer age, is a story even more remarkable than the Orbitel. One that Western scientists absolutely refused to believe until they saw the evidence with their own eyes. In the next video, we are going inside MESM, the first Soviet computer, built in 1950, long before most Americans had ever heard the word computer.